looking at the some issues around the ferry, the ferry contract and the ferry service going forward. Really, I appreciate that your officers yesterday had a meeting with PAC to discuss this, some of these related issues, which I also attended just to watch. I'm just going to introduce my side of the table. So I'm Deputy Montfortadie. I'm the chair of the panel.
I am Deputy Max Andrews.
Jeff Southern, member of the panel.
And online we've got...
hey, Karen.
Just test the sound out. Can you introduce yourself?
Oh,
I will introduce. We can't hear you, Karen, but we've got Deputy Wilson, who's joining us online, and I'm sure at some point we'll be able to hear her as well. Try again.
Can you hear me
Yes.
Oh, that's right. Perfect.
Good. So we've got the full complement on our side. And Minister, if you just introduce yourself and your team for the record, please.
Thank you, Deputy Kirsten Morel, Minister for Sustainable Economic Development.
Richard Corrigan, Chief Officer, Department for the Economy.
Thomas Brackenbury, Sector Lead for Aviation and Maritime, Department for the Economy.
Thank you. Right, let's get straight in. And Minister, we will. We've got a fair amount of ground to cover. We've got roughly 90 minutes allocated. We'll try and keep our questions on point, and if you can do the same, and if I do need to bring you back, it's not out of any lack of politeness. It's just to try and keep us focused. So, are there any initial learnings that you take as Minister from the undertaking of a shortened procurement process after the initial process that happened?
Can I just ask what you mean by learning specifically around the second process?
Yeah, so I think yesterday the previous procurement process was taken care of by PAC. So our question is really focusing on this latest tender process. Can you tell us what you learnt from that?
So I think one of the things that I think was a clear improvement upon the first was having an independent party playing a role not just in formulating the process, which is what happened in the first one, but in actually assessing the bids. That gave us a much higher degree of confidence in the results. I think that was a really, really good version. Obviously, the speed with which it took place was interesting. And, whilst I think the process was incredibly thorough, and a lot of the work was obviously reproduced from the first process in the second process, which enabled the bidders to actually come to the table. I think, obviously, ordinarily you wouldn't undertake the process in that kind of speed, at that kind of time frame. But we did do that, and we did do it very well. But obviously there was a significant effort to make that happen.
So in terms of the independent party who either made or helped make the decision, could you just tell us who that was?
Yeah, that was KPMG.
Yeah. But KPMG were involved in the first round, weren't they, in some form?
In the kind of setup of it. So they were involved in creating the tender, helping us draw up the tender documents, and creating the framework for that first process. They didn't take any part in the adjudication element of it or the analysis of it. In the second process, we wanted a third party who could bring their independent view to the actual assessment of the bids. Importantly, I think KPMG, they used both staff in Jersey and London, and so the team in London clearly have no kind of what's the word I'm looking
Connection.
for?
Skin in the game bias.
Well, there's no bias. Yeah, I mean that's it. They clearly, they're a team in London. But the fact that they had played a role in the first process in terms of creating that process meant they did have an understanding of ferries in Jersey, and actually they'd done a really big piece of work for Jersey and Guernsey prior to the process taking place at all, where we analysed the ferry services in the Channel Islands, and they did that with us as well. So as a third party, they were the best suited because they had knowledge of Channel Island ferries.
Yeah. There was some confusion at one point prior in the first tender process, or towards the end of it, about who was actually tendering in terms of, was it Condor, was it Brittany Ferries? We heard that again yesterday. Yeah. So can I just ask, first of all, when did it become apparent that to you that it seemed that it was Condor that was tendering?
Yeah, so the tender criteria were set out very clearly on the basis of who was tendering. There were legal definitions of bidder, defined in the documentation. There was a legal definition for operator. The operator had to be the successful bidder, as defined. The bidder was Brittany Ferries. All of the documentation was Brittany Ferries as the bidder. officers from the Jersey side became suspicious as we started to work through, particularly, as I referenced yesterday, what we called the Gatwick meetings, which took place around about mid-September. 4 days of discussion with Brittany Ferries in the mornings, DFDS in the afternoons, to hammer out questions that they had of us, we had of them, and to work through the legal draft contract in detail. The Brittany Ferries delegation were almost interchangeably using Condor, Brittany, Condor, and we made it very clear to them at the time that Brittany Ferries has tendered. We expect to see Brittany Ferries delivering the services, and given the fleet investment plans for Brittany Ferries as a mainline brand, we couldn't see where they would have any vessels in their own direct ownership or contingency should Condor fail, because their vessels were outsized compared to what the harbour needs.
They're too big for Jersey's harbour.
Yeah. So we had that suspicion as we went along. Nevertheless, we were proceeding in good faith to assess a Brittany Ferries bid. When it got to the final evaluation, and actually it happened just after I'd recused myself from the process and tender process one, it remained a point that the ministers were pushing hard with Christophe Mathieu, the acting CEO of Condor and actual CEO of Brittany Ferries, to say who is actually bidding here. And Christophe came back in an email to the Chief Minister, I think copied to yourself, Minister, saying the bidder is Condor. Now, had that been clear at the outset...
Sorry, they said the contract would be signed with Condor.
Yeah, and had that been clear at the outset, almost certainly Condor would have been qualified out because they would have passed financial standing tests.
And is that because, am I correct in saying essentially the basis for this whole tender process was to seek a replacement for Condor anyway, because you weren't happy with Condor's...
Well, it was to seek a new operator. That could have been Brittany Ferries, but it's fair to say, because in a parallel track, Condor had come to the government asking for huge amounts of financial support. It showed a very distressed business, and we just don't think that's compatible with delivering lifeline services to the island.
So I guess what I'm saying, if Condor had said, just come to you and said, look, we want to operate and tender for this service, you'd have probably said no.
They'd had actually 2 earlier attempts to do that. So they'd been invited, on the back of COVID, they'd been invited to put proposals forwards for services. So in autumn 21, autumn 22, even as late as autumn 23, the ministers opposite number in Guernsey were still saying, we think we can still do a direct deal with Condor. At that point, we decided that, metaphorically, the ship had sailed, and it was time to go out to the marketplace, which of course is what we did.
I think if I can very quickly, I think that's quite an important point. Condor had in 22 kind of direct access. They provided, we asked them for, and they provided proposals for an extension of their contract or a new contract for another 10 or 15 years. Those proposals were lacking in the extreme, is what I would say. And we made it really clear to them, certainly after the first one, this isn't even close to good enough. Please give us another one. And we were really disappointed with this.
So just to answer specifically the question about the time, what the time that you became aware of that was the time you said you could recuse yourself. What's the period are we talking about?
So my recusal was about 21st of October, I think. Christophe Mathieu's email was 2024. Christophe Mathieu's email was the 1st of November 24.
That's fine. So we got a ballpark. That's all I wanted. Yeah. And so was it clear then when you entered into the second tender process that it was Brittany Ferries bidding and DFDS bidding? You were quite happy that it wasn't Condor that would be
as we understood it at that time, yes.
Okay. And I have to ask this question, but there's been some suggestions that the second tender process was effectively a done deal. You'd already had a preference for DFDS, that they'd effectively already won the first one, although that they didn't meet the legal challenge. Is that a reasonable point for people to make?
I think it's understandable why people would suggest that or have that suspicion. I know truly in my heart, as the decision maker, that was never the case. It was quite simply a case that at the end of tender process one, from a Jersey perspective, we couldn't have awarded to either bidder. There were reasons why I would have loved to have given this contract to Brittany Ferries, kind of non-business reasons, so to speak, more political reasons, relationships with Brittany, relationships with Normandy, France, etc., etc. There were many reasons why I would love to give this. And I may even have said at some point to Brittany Ferries, please, on this financial standing, on this commercial operations side, that's where you need to change, that's where you need to up your game. Because I knew that there were many reasons to give it to Brittany Ferries. At the end of the day, the scores came in 55 to Brittany Ferries, 74 to Condor, to DFDS, apologies. It was clear blue water between the two.
Can I just add very quickly? It's fair to say also that in the application for a judicial review that was lodged by Brittany Ferries, the Royal Court and then the Court of Appeal comprehensively threw out any suggestions that they'd been biased towards Brittany Ferries' bid in either process.
Yeah, I think we can come back to that. My understanding is that they pretty much said it's not in the public interest to pursue this because in the cause of good public administration. They didn't necessarily say that Condor didn't have a case.
No, they actually called their arguments weak, and they did say they did throw out the allegation.
Not in the first.
They threw out the allegation of bias.
Yeah.
The first doesn't matter. What matters is the end, and at the end they threw out the allegations of bias, and they called Brittany Ferries' arguments weak.
Okay, we may come back to that, but we're not here today to look at that specifically. But you've already raised the suggestion about the political consideration. So, in terms of our relationship with Guernsey and our relationship with Brittany, for example, are there any longer term implications from the decision that's been made? And have you got any steps, I suppose, to try and maybe rebuild those relationships if they've indeed been damaged?
I think one of the good things is on the Guernsey side, I phoned my counterpart in Guernsey just a couple of weeks ago. Very much, not an official call, very much me phoning on a weekend to have a chat, discuss inter-island services, that sort of thing. So whilst I know that certainly from the press that I see in Guernsey, some of the kind of social media comments, things like this, I would say there has been some damage to that relationship, at least at the kind of population perspective. I have no doubt that any damaged relationships will be rebuilt, and I think it's really important I can still pick up the phone to my counterpart in Guernsey. On the Brittany side, we continue to work in Brittany in all sorts of areas, and one of the things is a kind of unintended benefit, I believe, but one of the benefits of there being two ferries providers for the Channel Islands is that now the Port of St Malo should have even more business going on. It's got two different providers, it's got more ships going in there than would have been the case with just one provider. So there are clear economic benefits, I think, for the Port of St Malo. And I've talked about that with the President of Brittany as well. And, we want to work together to realise those benefits and work in other areas such as fishing, offshore wind farms and so on.
Okay, I think we'll ask specifically about inter-island travel later, but that could arise from this. But I think it's one of our questions.
Yeah, coming up to date, what, if any, contingency for ferry services are in place for 2025 when DFDS begin their service from the 28th of March 2025?
I think officially for about 3 days. I think it's 31st of March is the end of the contingency.
Well, it's sort of coterminous. So the contingency ends as DFDS commences. So the contingency only existed because we were concerned for Condor's perilous position, and that's been demonstrably the case. The Minister endeavoured to try and, through correspondence, get commitments out of Brittany Ferries and Condor. There was nothing of satisfaction, so the contingency had to be extended up until expiry of the current operating agreement, which is 27th of March 25. We have absolute confidence in DFDS going forward, so the contingency will fall away at that point.
Can it be said that I understand why the contingency was put in place, but could it be said the fact that you didn't need the contingency and that in fact Condor have remained solvent right until the end of this process means that actually those fears were not warranted and that Condor is actually a solvent and reliable company?
I don't think that's something you can say if you put yourself in our shoes back in December 2023.
Yeah.
Insurance is insurance. Insurance is something you pay for and hope never to use. That's effectively the situation we're in. The contingency was an insurance policy that we paid for ourselves. The counterfactual is Condor did go bust. They had written to us asking for £80 million underwriting and £40 million. And even when we then, towards last year, when we said, if you don't win this contract, will you be able to continue? They said, well, we'll need 11 to 36 million pounds. That's coming directly from the company itself. They're telling me in black and white they don't have the financial capability of surviving, that they are, as Richard said, in a perilous position. I cannot look at that and ignore it and just cross my fingers and hope it goes away.
But in the end, they didn't go bust, and they found other.
And that's to their. I'm really pleased.
But the contingency was put in place only after that point. So when Brittany Ferries, I think, has stepped in to secure financing,
No.
No.
So when was the contingency put in place?
So contingency was put in place in December of 2023, very shortly after the first notification that Condor had, when they came to government looking for that level of financial support, with some of it literally, we need it by the end of next week. That's how critical things were. So the first contingency was put in place, I think the date was the 19th of December from memory. There was a short window using a vessel called the Finlandia Seaways, which we know was not an ideal fit. It's, outsized for the harbour, but it was the best of what was available at that immediate point in time to have something. We then worked through those contingency arrangements to find something that was much more suitable and much more resilient over time. But, in February 2024, Matt Thomas, Chief Executive Ports of Jersey, and I represented Jersey at an all-parties meeting in London. It was a boardroom with a sort of table that sat about 30 people around it, and then people sat in the wings. It was all of Condor's lenders, all of Condor's shareholders, all of their respective advisors, and the islands talking about the financial mess that was Condor's balance sheet. So there's absolutely no doubt in my mind from everything around that meeting, Condor was in a mess. We're very grateful for the forbearance of Condor's lender group, who have continued to support the company up to this point. And I have to say, there has been some money that's gone in from one or more of the shareholders to help keep the lights on at a critical point in time. But nonetheless, the risk has been assessed to be so significant, we've had to keep that contingency running in the background. As the Minister said, it's an insurance policy, hope never to use.
I think if I could just quickly come in as well, there are another two facts which I think need to be highlighted. One is Condor, back in December 2023 and into 2024, had a court judgment against it in maritime court. It'd been bought by Poole Harbour authorities, and it was basically the first stage of a two-stage process whereby Condor's ships could be impounded at a moment's notice. So we knew in December 2023 that Condor had maritime court judgments against it in the UK that would enable Poole Harbour to impound any of Condor's vessels in any UK port at any time.
Yeah. So it's Admiralty claims in rem is the process,
the
but
actual
Poole Harbour
process.
had gone to the Admiralty Court in the UK and secured claims in rem against all of Condor's vessels.
And
so
this
that
only-
meant a
I think
lifeline
it's also
freight
really
vessel
important.
could have been locked
That
in.
only became clear once we had set off looking for contingency. So we had the letters from Condor. At no point did they mention that they had court cases against them and judgments against them. No point did they mention that. We found that out through our own contacts with Poole Harbour. It was something of a shock. And then secondly, very quickly, is the letter that was sent to me in September 2024, when I asked, Condor shareholders, can you guarantee services if you were not to win this tender process? Their response was clearly no, we cannot guarantee services if we do not win this tender process. Again, so that's telling me as late as September 24 that I cannot count on Condor to keep themselves financially above water.
Can you remind us of the overall cost of contingencies for
It was
Jersey?
approximately
today?
£5 million.
Yeah.
£5 million today. And I suppose looking forward, and this goes back to our initial question about learning, what provisions are there in the current agreement with DFDS to stop this kind of thing happening again? So were DFDS to find themselves in a position of that Condor was in, is there something that would kick into?
Yeah. There's a lot of other protection. The concession agreement for the new arrangement is 132 pages long. It's very comprehensive in terms of
is there anything you can tell us specifically?
Yeah, it's financial reporting requirements, there's route reporting requirements, there's capacity and service demand, there are service criteria and KPIs, there are penalties for non-delivery. So there's a whole variety
But
of things.
also in the event of them having some sort of their own financial problems, there are protections where we
there's an
we can
escalation.
withdraw.
There's an escalation
Say
process.
the contract is now terminated within this period and we can appoint a different operator. Is that
I believe that's the case.
is that the
Yeah,
case?
yeah. So basically, if there's problems with the FDS, we have much more protections in the realms of the current contract than in the outgoing operating agreement, where Condor had no responsibility to provide us with financial information. The other important aspect to note here is that DFDS is a publicly listed company. So they have market transparency responsibilities of their own. So we can check in real time, as they do their investor relations updates, what the performance of the company is, what the outlook for the company is.
Well, can we ask about that actually? Because there's been a suggestion. I mean, their share price has dropped considerably, hasn't it? Even in the last 6 months.
If I may.
Have you got any concerns about the?
If I could say, I think it's fascinating how my counterpart in Guernsey has been pointing people in the direction of DFDS's share price, I'd suggest focusing on their own ferry services and forgetting about Jersey's. I think it's, you know,
No, but we're asking-
it is not my concern where their share price is. It's what my concern is, are they financially viable? Are they financially running? Are they being run well? Yes. Am I going to sit and watch their share price day in, day out, like my counterpart in Guernsey is? No, I'm not.
It's just that your officer has said that we can see their share price and it's a matter of...
No, he said you can see their
To the financial
reporting.
performance, they have to report and give updates to the marketplace.
And I think that has an effect on market confidence though, doesn't it? So
It does, and I think if you look at the last investor relations update, I think you'll see quite clearly, why the market sentiment at the moment is looking the way that it's looking, and what the plan is for the company to address that. We are comforted by having such public transparency of a company. By contrast, you go to the Brittany Ferries website, they appear to be quite overdue in publishing their own accounts to their own website.
And obviously we have no
Speaks
idea.
very differently of transparency.
We have no idea what Brittany Ferries' share price would be because we've no idea. You never will have any idea.
thank you. So look, we're going to... the aim of this is to look forward, not so much back, but inevitably there's a midpoint, I suppose. I'm going to turn now, I suppose, to inter-island travel. So in your letter, Minister, of the 7th of February, you identified that you had requested DFDS to reciprocate the Brittany Ferries inter-island service. Can you confirm the current status of discussions with Guernsey counterparts, as well as Brittany Ferries or other parties, about their involvement in establishing inter-island?
So that's for DFDS to work through with Brittany Ferries.
Is there any requirement in the current contract about, is there any mention of inter-island travel?
Yes, there is. There's mention of inter-island and there's a mention of the intention to provide inter-island services where possible, but it's not part of the contractual arrangement.
So that can't be compelled. You couldn't compel DFDS to run an inter-island service?
In the Joint Channel Islands tender, it specified a number of inter-island rotations. The only appointment that came from that first tender round was Guernsey's appointment of Brittany Ferries, and it would appear that they've not made any mandatory provision for inter-island services arising from an appointment at tender process 1. It would have been unfair on Jersey's service provider, whoever that was to be at the end of tender process 2, to place the full onus on them to deliver inter-island services that may not be commercially viable, and therefore a bit of a dead weight around their business. So what we've said to DFDS is we would like them to reciprocate with the 1 sailing a week, and if further sailings are added by Brittany Ferries / Guernsey, then to look at reciprocating and adding further sailings if they're commercially viable.
You know, I mean, you asked Chair as well for, kind of discussions between the islands. As I said earlier, I was on the phone to my counterpart in Guernsey just 2 Sundays ago, asking about inter-island services. Obviously, we have Morshiel Express. We speak and work with them as well. And obviously, there's a new player, Islands Unlimited, who are hoping to start up those services.
Is there anyone else that you're in conversation with about running a potentially?
I'm not in conversation. I have heard of a potential other inter-island provider, but I don't know how advanced their plans. I don't know. It's similar to Islands Unlimited. It's a startup, so I don't know where they base themselves, whether it be in Guernsey or Jersey.
In terms of when we're looking at, say, inter-island sailings, when we had Condor ferries, of course, before we knew where we were because they were obviously, commuting between Jersey and Guernsey. But what impact has it had with Guernsey obviously going with a different operator compared to Jersey going with DFDS?
Well, as the court case showed, the court case, I was just looking for the quote, the court case, the judgment, the summary judgment we've had said it was Guernsey's decision to end the joint Channel Island process. That's written down in the court records now. And so I think that was their choice to end that process. They, therefore, by doing that, created an issue around inter-island services. That was their creation. They've created that. We are working together to solve that. Economically, inter-island services are not economically of great importance.
No.
Culturally and socially, I believe they are, particularly for sporting communities and other voluntary communities. from an economic perspective, there's very little impact.
Yeah.
But from that social perspective, there is greater impact, and we're alive to that, and this is why we're talking.
And so maybe if we're looking
Sort
at,
that
say,
issue.
the first process that happened, obviously Jersey and Guernsey were appraising the situation separately, and of course Guernsey firstly came up and said, look, we are going with Condor. But do you feel, if you're looking back retrospectively, if the process was, say, to happen again, and if there's any learnings, that perhaps the role of the UK might have come into this to ensure that there was some level of independence, to ensure that there is a recommendation to both islands instead of both islands going their
So I
separate
think
ways?
the UK, you mean the UK government?
UK, or even say an independent
The UK
invigilator.
quite simply has no place in this process, none
no.
whatsoever.
No.
And I would resist any call for a UK government to be involved in something.
And
There's
do you,
no need for that
and do you think,
whatsoever.
say, with is it KPMG, that they potentially could have had a greater role in that
So
process?
in the first process, that's one of the things that I personally would change. I'd
Yeah.
have that independent assessor in there
Yeah.
at the beginning,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah, okay.
And one of
That's
the
good
reasons
to
is,
know.
I believe this was told to the Public Accounts Committee yesterday, one of the reasons is we saw some very strange increases in Guernsey's marks for Condor as
Hmm.
a result of that first process. Very unusual spikes, where they moved low scores to very high scores for no reason that we could see.
And can I ask, Minister, I mean, did you feel a bit uncomfortable going into the first tender process, knowing that the Guernsey government had made this financial commitment for Condor to obviously keep on going?
So I think it's important that Guernsey had bought that vessel at a time when we were in this project looking at ferry services, and that was meant to be an open book project where we had agreed to share all information between the islands on whatever we were doing with ferries. Guernsey chose to buy a vessel, a ferry, without telling Jersey at all during an exercise on open book exercise on ferry services. So that was a huge shock. But and did it tie them to Condor / Brittany ferries? It probably did. We have letters which, when you read them, you realise that you can see that they are saying Condor must be in the final selection for the tender process, etc., or the incumbent, they say, must be in there. I went into that first process with pure goodwill, good faith and optimism that we would find a joint provider.
Yeah.
That tender process was ended by Guernsey on its own volition, its own desire not to allow any further conversation on that matter. So Guernsey created the situation that we are in today, and it's a huge shame that was the case. And was there financial commitment to Condor part of that? I mean, the public can draw their own conclusions, but I know where mine are.
If I might just,
Sorry, can I cut in? It's not one of our core questions, so I think that's more
That's fine,
for PAC, so I don't mean to cut anyone
Of
off at the
course.
knees. I know something's been suggested before though. We'll move on just to another aspect of inter-island travel actually. So it was reported in the local media that DFDS would consider offering 25 realistic day trips. I presume that means to France. And as the other day trip schedules only give visitors 1 hour or less at the destination before the return sailing. Could you talk to us about what you know about
so
day trips?
DFDS published yesterday actually with the Chamber of Commerce the exact number of movements. So I think they, first of all, in the contract we have with DFDS, we have day trips. Guernsey's contract with Brittany Ferries, there are no day trips. To have a day in St Malo, you need to spend 2 nights accommodation in St Malo, which also renders the price comparisons meaningless as well, because you had 2 nights hotel stay. It's fundamentally different. DFDS have 31 day trips to France where there's more than 5 hours in St Malo. They are looking at adding some additional capacity, but when the tender was constructed, in no small part is about trying to drive inward tourism to Jersey to promote the visitor economy. And then the secondary aspect is, can we fit in some day trips around that? Because we know how much island residents value those long days in St Malo where they can come in. So the default position is we want as long a day as possible for French visitors to come to Jersey and spend in our economy here. And then DFDS are working in those additional days that they can to give Jersey residents as many hours as possible in St Malo. But already in the current schedule, there are 31 day trips with more than 5 hours that you can spend in St Malo. And in the peak summer, we'll have up to 3 rotations per day. That's vastly different to anywhere we've been in recent times with Condor.
I want to look at the inter-island travel as well, particularly the day trip market, I guess, is that a lot of European visitors see the Channel Islands as a group, an archipelago, as Victor Hugo might have said, and, we don't necessarily think of them like that. So they might want to come to Jersey first, go to Guernsey either for day trips or for a few days, and the other way around. And it seems strange at the moment we've got 3 ferry operators if we include Morshill. We've got a new entrant here in Guernsey with Islands Unlimited, and potentially we're talking about a 5th one that's going to run services between Guernsey and Jersey. And at the moment there's no way to travel between the islands, it seems, on a regular basis, and not that many day trips to France either, certainly not to Saint Malo, and probably not to Normandy either. Is that a missed opportunity, and do you think that's something that is likely to improve, Minister?
So it's something I really want to improve. So I think, regional connectivity, as I call it, so the connectivity within the Gulf of Mont Saint-Michel, to me is really important. I think it's also something that is likely to need subsidy. We know that, for instance, the Morshill Express service receives €2 million a year from the Department of La Manche as a subsidy. So I think that gives you a really big indication of the level of public support, public financial support you need to provide those services. I'm open to that because I think just in the business support briefing earlier, and we were talking about the importance of investing in our infrastructure, and that level of kind of regional infrastructure is, I think, really important. Of course, you can fly to Guernsey today. There are flights every day to Guernsey. So if you're a tourist coming to Jersey, you can, no question, fly to Guernsey. I think I wish Islands Unlimited all the best. I hope they succeed because that will be a great solution between here and Guernsey. Equally, Morshill Express, we need to be entering into conversations with La Manche about the future of that service, the long-term future of that services. My view is Jersey should be prepared to invest in that service. Otherwise, the only connections we will have to France will be via Saint Malo.
So if we accept that we probably need to subsidise inter-island travel and possibly day trip travel, would it not have been better to actually include that in the tender process with the DFDS and say, look, we will subsidise inter-island travel, but we'd like you to provide it?
It wasn't really possible to include it in the tender process with DFDS because at the stage as well, we didn't know anything about the contract, the Brittany ferries, how that would be provided. The tender was with Guernsey kind of bringing an end to the joint process. The tender was very much Jersey-only services, so it was very much about the St Malo link and the Portsmouth Pool link. That's the piece of work we're doing now.
Yeah, I mean, those are all the points. From the point of closing the scoring on tender process 1 and the Minister receiving a letter from Deputy Inder on the 17th of October, there was an intransigent position from Guernsey. They would not enter into any discussion about what the different positions meant for a joint process. We respect that Guernsey couldn't appoint DFDS because of the fail in the legals, because we too had assessed the DFDS as a fail on the legals. Guernsey have written to Brittany Ferries saying they believe the process was compliant and they couldn't appoint a failed bidder, which is why they appointed Brittany Ferries. Ergo, from Jersey's perspective, Brittany Ferries failed in 2 aspects of the criteria. We couldn't appoint Brittany Ferries. So there's a different line being peddled out of Guernsey, even as recently as this morning from Deputy Inder. That's wrong. But it's important to say that we wanted to have those conversations in the days after scoring had closed about what it meant for a joint process and inter-island travel. Guernsey would not enter into those conversations.
So talking about where we are now, I get your point about potentially Saint Malo have got benefits because they've got 2 operators now coming to them. But if we get a much more... So what should have happened in an ideal world, the original position was that we have 1 operator servicing France, Jersey, Guernsey, UK. Now we're potentially looking at... won't include Morshill because they're already there. But, maybe we've got potentially 4 operators running now between Jersey, Guernsey, and then also the 2 running between north and south. Does ramp time become an issue? So it's fine to say you've got all these extra services, but will they be able to get access?
It could do.
And will they be able to share? And will they be willing to share? Is the key point.
I know at our side, we're very willing to share that, I think,
Yeah.
from the Port's perspective.
So it would be the operational implications would be assessed by Ports of Jersey. Obviously, Jersey operates on a system of ramp licenses, and the ramp license wouldn't be issued without a successful deconfliction report.
I think it's worth saying, though, also that DFDS have offered to have our northbound service, so our high-speed craft going north to Poole, to have that call to drop off in Guernsey on its way north, not to pick up in Guernsey for the next bit of the journey, but just to drop off, or alternatively for that to pick up at Guernsey to come to Jersey on the way back. And that's been rejected in discussions with Brittany Ferries because they don't trust the process.
I must jump in and say that is incredibly frustrating. So DFDS have proposed a perfectly viable way of using their northern ferry to create an inter-island service, particularly at the weekend, which is when I'd like to see it there. That has been rejected. And I mean, I can see no good reason why that's the case.
But can I go back to what deconfliction report means? So you say that...
Well, the idea that simply that there'd be the time and the space to allow the vessel to come alongside berth, go out again without it causing any operational implications for the harbour's wider operations or for another ferry
So
concept.
basically to deconflict access to the ramps.
Yeah.
So there's no two ferries trying to get one ramp at the same time.
Can you understand either DFDS's or Brittany's point of view is that they've been offered exclusivity in either island of a contract? And so if I were Brittany Ferries, I might think I don't necessarily want... in fact, if I was DFDS, I might think by running services from Jersey to Guernsey as a day trip, what's to stop somebody getting off the boat and then getting onto a Brittany Ferries to go to the UK? Potentially, and Brittany Ferries might offer special offers for people to do that rather than just using a direct service from...
That's a risk. I mean, these are all things that we would have wanted to talk about after the scoring and close on tender process one. That opportunity wasn't afforded.
I think it's also, I think there is a worry about that sort of leakage. But from a DFDS perspective, and I was talking to them yesterday about this, they would not, for instance, put on, if they went from Jersey to Guernsey to Poole, they would not make it possible to book a Guernsey to Poole service with them. You wouldn't be able to go on their website and find that as a service. So they would not be picking people up in Guernsey and taking them to the UK.
And I think in terms of coming off one operator and going on to the other for the next bit of the journey, it won't quite work like that in so much as the high-speed craft for Brittany Ferries, we understand we're based in Saint Malo, leave there in the morning, go north and then back. Whereas we have the reverse, we'll have a vessel based in Poole that will come south in the morning and then head back. So they're running in opposite directions.
The timing doesn't work.
I get what you're saying. But is it fair to say we may have to wait and see if there are any unintended consequences and that the market might resolve it, or it might need some kind of discussions, interventions?
I think that's fair.
We'll leave that there, I think. I'll pass over to Deputy Andrews.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Minister, I just want to ask you, with the appointment of DFDS and their new schedule, will there be a decrease or an increase in sailings compared to what Condor were providing previously?
I think in general we're already seeing there's effectively an increase in sailing.
Yeah.
I know that sometimes the days, people have seen changes in the days. Obviously, that happened on the Condor all the time. They changed things all the time.
Yeah.
And I think we mustn't forget the service we've been receiving for the last 20 years. But I think overall it's an increase. But Richard, you may...
Yes, so what we'll see is daily freight arrivals, we'll see a daily RoPax arrival, which is similar kind of timing to what you see at the moment when, on the Condor service, the Goodwill arrives in the morning and either the Islander or the Clipper arrive in the evening. What you will see going forward is the Arrow arriving in the morning and then the Stena Vinga arriving in the evening. On the high-speed craft side, you will still have a high-speed craft going up and down from Jersey to Poole, or Poole to Jersey and back, I should say. Where we'll see the main increase, however, is on the route to France, where we'll have a dedicated high-speed craft just between Jersey and France. So we'll see a significant increase
on that route,
sailings.
Looking at the FDS's figures, they're saying a 56% increase in the number of sailings to France, and they're also saying a 47% increase in the number of sailings to the UK.
And in terms of, say, the size of the vessels that DFDS have compared to Condor, are we talking about vessels that are bigger and that have a larger capacity for freight, for instance, or is there not much difference?
We will have, yes, it's similar capacity vessels in terms of freight, for example. However, there will be less freight because it's a Jersey-only service. So that gives us better capacity to pick up from bad weather events or technical delays or anything else that might happen. On the passenger side, I think the two vessels are broadly similar in size on a high-speed craft to those of Voyager and Liberation. I think the one on the southern route is quite similar to the old Rapide vessel that used to ply between. So these are substantial vessels with a significant capacity that DFDS are eager to fill.
And when we're looking, for instance, now with DFDS obviously operating with Jersey, the UK and France, do you think our harbour will now have a better capacity to deal with the freight that is coming through the island, and will we see a reduction of freight due to Jersey and Guernsey going their separate ways?
So in a sense, you won't see a reduction of freight coming here. In fact, I'd like to think, particularly in the southern route, what I'm keen over the coming years is to see freight build up from that side.
Yeah.
So you won't see a reduction in freight that's landed in Jersey.
No.
If you know what I mean.
Okay.
But obviously ports have a master plan, and really importantly, that plan is about making the freight area work a lot better. Deconflicting, to use that word again, with the passengers and the travellers. Because at the moment, if you think when you go to the Elizabeth terminal, you've got lots of very large freight trucks, and you're trying to either walk or drive through the middle of them to get to the passenger terminal. The new layout separates all that, so passengers will have a much nicer experience. But it creates more space for freight to take part, which again enables greater competition in the sector.
And freight demand is reasonably finite because really it's the sum of consumption from the island. So out with any major building projects that require the import of goods, it's generally just the sum of consumption. So it's quite a steady flow of business. But as I say, we will have 2 sailings a day that can carry significant freight volumes. At Guernsey, we'll have 1 sailing a day, which has to combine freight and passengers and vehicles on the islander. And then they'll have the high-speed crafts who have a lot more freight capacity and a lot more optionality to pick up from bad weather.
And so what can we expect from DFDS that is different from Condor? And is there anything in particular that is new that was not previously provided?
That's a very good question. I think at its core, the service is similar. It's a ferry service at the end of the day. I think it's really important what we saw DFDS saying yesterday. They want to provide frequency, they want to provide reliability. And reliability is really very, very much where I want it to be. We have seen, I think, over years, an unreliable service. We're going to see £300 million of investment in the new fleet within 6 or 7 years. Again, I have to contrast that with Guernsey, which has no pounds allocated to fleet investment. Guernsey, as my understanding from what I've seen in the media, is that Guernsey has a promise that Brittany Ferries will sit down and talk to Guernsey in 6 to 7 years' time about fleet investment. That's the only promise they have. We have £300 million invested, promised. We have financial resilience, a group guarantee on service for all islanders. So that's really important because that wasn't available in either the existing or the Brittany Ferries version. I think we've already seen that they're responsive. We've seen them change their pets, their bicycles, policies, etc. One of the key things that we've got is a cap on future price rises. So that's something, we saw some really significant price rises both in the freight and the passenger market over the last few years. And we sit there sometimes wondering how they are so large. We have capped that using RPI, so it's index linked to inflation, but there's capping now for the rest of the contract. From the freight perspective, that gives businesses a level of certainty they've never seen before. They know what the ferry prices effectively are going to be for the next 20 years. That's incredible. And I think that then speaks to the flat rate card as well, which has created a level of the ability to have competition in the sector, an ability for us to have transparency. Now we know how much it costs to bring, that pallet of goods on a ferry to Jersey. We've never known that in the past. So these price rises that we've seen, we've never known if they're justified or not because we've had no view of it. We now know how much the ferry costs. And we now know how those prices will rise over the future linked to RPI. So I think we've got much greater visibility. It makes Jersey a much stronger investment prospect, in my view. Because if you're an island, I've not directly spoken to those retailers. My department is speaking to retailers looking to move in Jersey. They have to shift their goods to Jersey. They now know if they're signing a 10-year lease or 9-year lease, they now know roughly where their prices are going to be for bringing goods to Jersey for the next 20 years. That helps that investment case for Jersey significantly.
There's one additional important point. I think the island's done a great deal in terms of the social agenda. So, living wage, for example, coming to the fore so that people are paid properly for a proper day's work. On the ferries, the Condor contract in the past has been subject to a lot of criticism from the RMT in the UK around exploitative terms, is how they've described it. DFDS have a first-class pedigree in crewing. You'll see already that one of the high-speed craft has been reflagged onto UK registry, which means UK levels of pay and crewing standards as opposed to lowest common denominator. So again, it removes that reputational stain that sat on the Condor business for what was described by the RMT as exploitative conditions.
As an aside, possibly the biggest surprise in all of the procurement process was to receive a letter from the Director General of the RMT, the RMT union, which actually said, pick DFDS, they're really good from a pay perspective, don't pick Condor.
Okay.
They've been exploitative. Now, it's important to say that Brittany Ferries does have a good reputation around pay. I think that is really important to say, but Condor didn't.
Yeah. I mean, the obvious quip would be to say that, but you still gave it to Condor, we still operated with Condor, and we did nothing to say that we didn't approve of their practices previously.
Well,
I mean, I remember
I think since I became minister,
Yeah.
all I've really worked on is this ferry tender process.
I
in terms
remember
of
asking
ferries.
Senator McLean at the time when he was Treasury about why
imagine.
Condor ferries.
To assure you, Chair,
If I could just say, I'm not Senator McLean, so I can't speak for what he said.
but just to assure you, part of our tender criteria did exactly deal with those sorts of points. So there were scores for that social responsibility of the organisation, crewing and welfare and so on. So whilst it may not have happened in the moment, those sorts of things have been noted and made sure that when we can renegotiate towards a new contract, that has been taken into account, that we build better conditions going forwards.
So there's going to be a lot of questions that we're going to ask about the concession agreement, but ultimately, a lot of these questions won't need to be asked if the concession agreement is put into the public domain. So we know that redacted copies of previous operating agreements between harbours and Condor Limiters were publicly hosted on the Ports of Jersey website. Can you confirm whether there's going to be any public availability of the current concession agreement? And if not, why not?
It's not something I've thought about, to be honest with you. I always feel slightly uncomfortable about putting commercial documents in the public domain, but
I suppose what we say is unless there's a good
as long as
reason,
it's appropriately
reason for it, 'cause
redacted.
the tender process has now happened.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of understanding, for example, what those price caps are, what the RPI are, what the flat rate card means, etc.
I think that's absolutely fair. I've got no in principle issue with it. I just need to make sure it's appropriately redacted from a commercial
obviously
perspective.
in conversation with the operator.
I think one of the things I've been saying now, I've said throughout this, is the transparency. So I would be keen to provide that transparency as well. I think it'll just take us some time to make sure this 123-page document is appropriately redacted.
I will ask this question, but I'll keep it brief. Hopefully you can as well. Is that one of the suggestions was that it was difficult. Condor were not a sustainable operator because they were servicing such high levels of debt. Presumably that needed to be figured into their business model. So ticket pricing needed to service that debt. DFDS don't seem to have that problem. So does that mean we're likely to see cheaper tickets from DFDS in the long term than we would have from Condor?
I think, well, it's interesting because it's two different business models. I think we're already seeing, ignoring recent headlines, which are genuinely just headlines. There's very little substance to them. I think we can see that the pricing is similar. There is a cost to bringing people to Jersey. There's a cost to bringing people to Guernsey. Whilst Condor's model had to include debt repayments, of course it did. I mean, Jersey's business model, the one that we signed up to, has to include that future fleet financing. So in that sense, there's £300 million commitment, and that has to be paid for through those ticket prices. So I think that's one reason why you won't see any significant price differences. But DFDS operate in some of the most competitive ferry markets. They do the Dover-Calais route, the Dover-Dunkirk routes. They're immensely competitive. They know the importance of maintaining good pricing. The situation we have was obviously lacking competition, but we've effectively put in price regulation as a result of that. So I think over the course of the 20-year period, I think you'll see increasingly good value through the pricing. Whether it will be massively cheaper or not than what's happening in Guernsey, I have no idea. And to be honest, I'm not really worried about Guernsey's pricing.
Well, we heard it here first, so we'll be looking at those prices.
Call me back in 20 years.
Might be getting calls before then, but we'll see.
I think it's also important to say within the terms of the concession agreement, we've spoken about the maximum yield on the passenger side, but what we were keenest to gain regular insights into is the mean average. So maximum being if you book, very shortly before departure on a very popular service, but what are customers actually paying on average if they pay at a usual time for a popular service, and for the first time we can have those insights in real time, which we weren't party to under the.
But Minister, you weren't interested in a flat rate for passengers then, just for freight?
It's not something we looked into at all. No.
Do you think it would be beneficial for passengers to have certainty that they can book, even say if they need to book? A lot of people have to travel in school holidays, presumably.
It's very interesting. That could have been done. You could have had a flat rate for passengers. I think you would then have, obviously, given the price comparison news articles of recent days, you would then have seen some significant differences because you'd be getting some very low prices on the Condor Brittany Ferries route because they use dynamic pricing. And you wouldn't see any changes. So you would have no opportunity for particularly low price tickets. Equally, you would clearly never get higher price tickets either. So it is in some ways swings roundabouts. I think everybody is, as in islanders, are used to through planes, through their flights, through their experience on Condor at the moment. They're used to dynamic pricing. The whole travel industry uses dynamic pricing. I found it interesting. There was a question yesterday in the Chamber of Commerce lunch that said, is dynamic pricing the right thing? It's like, it doesn't matter if it's the right thing or not. It's what the industry uses. Condor used dynamic pricing today.
Yeah. So they don't use it in freight?
We didn't know what they used in freight.
No.
I think
we'll come to
freight.
freight in a moment.
So interesting, Brittany Ferries, as tendered in tender process one, which is where Guernsey have gone with appointment, despite the fact none of it's been made transparent, the model there was for dynamic pricing on freight as well. So there was a ladder structure, and then there was also a dynamic price attaching to it. But if you went on a Friday overnight into the Channel Islands, you'd pay more for your freight than if you came on a Monday overnight sailing.
Sorry, that's right.
Yeah.
It was.
We've moved on to freight organically, so to speak. So I do want to bring Deputy Wilson in at some point, and let me just consult my notes because I want to make sure we cover. But let's talk about freight maybe for the next 5 minutes or so. Because we've had a suggestion. I mean, I think the panel is fairly neutral on the subject, and we want to look at the facts. The presumption is that you let the free market dictate. So in the same way that there's dynamic pricing for passengers, the default position presumably is that there should be dynamic pricing and let the companies decide how much they want to charge. It's been suggested that actually, I think we've had a suggestion that there was a desire from some elements maybe within government to try and tackle the market dominance of a certain importer into Jersey or distributor, and that there was a special relationship between Condor, that they gave a discount to this operator. Now, isn't that just fair business? Isn't that just, were Condor not just entitled to do that? Especially if that operator then says we can pass those savings on to our customer.
I'd say from a competition law perspective, not when it's to the detriment of the market.
And did you ever raise that with the competition regulator? Did you
I haven't directly raised it, I don't believe. Obviously, the ferry freight support, the freight survey that they did, or not survey, study that they did, informed our views of what the competition regulator thought. And it requested greater transparency and understanding of those rate cards.
I mean, I'm being very careful not to name them. I don't know if that's probably the right thing to do, but if there was an issue, if there were concerns with this operator operating in a manner which was abusive to the market, or indeed perhaps illegally, that should have been something that the operator stepped in with, and they didn't seem to.
No, so what Condor have operated was a rate card that said the more volume you do, the cheaper the price. That's a perfectly reasonable structure for pricing in a marketplace.
In a competitive marketplace.
The issue here is that you don't have competition on the market. So if this was Dover-Calais with 3 different operators and high frequency of sailings, you've got arguably fairly perfect market conditions because you've got competition of provider and you've got different sailing times that may have peak and sort of off-peak aspects to them. Here you had 1 or 2 sailings a day that would bring in freight. Ostensibly, it's the one overnight sailing south that's bringing the freight into the island. The way that we've looked at this going forwards is that that's effectively like a toll bridge. We're granting a concession for 20 years to bring freight into the island to that operator. The demand for that is set by islanders as a whole. The demand for freight isn't set by Ferry Speed, Jersey Post, any other provider. They may carry it, but they are...
The pie is only so big.
Yeah, the island demand is based on consumption. That consumption is not determined by Jersey Post or Ferry Speed, it's determined by islanders. So we wanted to make sure that the freight part, which is a fairly finite volume, that was the argument for it being on a flat rate card. It was nothing to do with trying to, challenge a provider in the adjacent market sector. What it means, however, is that if you're a retailer, you can now transparently see what the cost of your freight was for the ferry part of the journey. That allows you to determine what the value for money is in any adjacent services that you procure. So whether that's from the hauliers on this side of the water, or if it's what the hauliers are doing for you on the northern side, you can determine those services and you pay accordingly for them. But you know that the bit in between is transparent because it's the same rate for everyone. What we didn't have on the outgoing rate card was enough certainty, and indeed complaints made to the JCRA, that the rate card Condor was supposed to be working to wasn't really being observed in its entirety. Now that's something for the JCRA to ultimately determine, not for government. There's a competition law, and if they're concerned, the JCRA can start an investigation. But it is the stuff of some legend locally. And indeed, in conversations that we've had with the acting CEO of Condor, it's fair to say there's been concern raised in our minds as to whether there was just that rate card in play or whether there were other factors in play over and above.
And I know we've asked questions in the Assembly about this, but one of the concerns, I suppose, is can you be sure that this operator, so the distributor, importer, who perhaps was able to make economies of scale because of a discounted purchase agreement, should we say, that they're not going to see their prices go up, which will then be passed on to customers. Is that a concern for you?
So we, obviously, from the freight pricing perspective, we've done analysis, and it shows that freight pricing is 7% of the cost of goods in the shops. The price rise we're seeing here is 14% of 7%, something like that. Ultimately, the kind of impact on your cost of goods in Jersey is 0.4%, and that's a one-off impact. That is not significant. That is, particularly for the price and transparency and the continuing thereafter kind of price regulation that goes on. We've now got Jersey into a position whereby we have forward sight, effectively, of freight pricing. That's an incredible benefit to this island.
It should also be clear that both of the bids, both Brittany Ferries, or actually it was Condor in the first bid, let's be clear about that, Condor and DFDS, in both bids, freight prices were going up from the outgoing agreement. So irrespective, there was a price rise coming. The two bids were fairly closely matched on where that freight price was going to be between a flat rate and then the mean average pricing that was proposed by the other operator.
Less than £1 difference.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, look, I think we've covered that. If we have further questions, we'll come back to you. Can I hand over to Deputy Wilson? She's got some questions for you as well. Thank you, Deputy Wilson. So,
thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I just wanted to follow on, if I could, before I ask my main question. Is there a difference in the charges to refrigerated and non-refrigerated freight? And if so, why is that?
There isn't a difference.
There isn't a difference, okay. That was just a query that we were asked by a member of the public, so thank you for clarifying that. I just want to come to the concession agreement, and thank you for forwarding that to us. One of the concerns has been about the break clause and what it is that you have agreed to the break clause to 20 years and why that was 20 years. If you could just explain that for the public.
Yeah, I mean, the 20 years, so it was really interesting. We didn't set out in the second procurement process for a 20-year agreement. I think we modelled it around a 15-year agreement effectively. Well, that's what we were expecting anyway. But it was very interesting. Both bidders, so separately and according to their own calculations, both bidders presented propositions for 20-year contracts. And effectively, the reasoning for that, and I fully understand the reasoning for that, it's because of the fleet investment that we're asking for. So the fleet investment on what is a smaller market, Jersey only as opposed to Channel Island market, required both operators, having done their very separate analysis, determined that they would need a 20-year concession agreement in order to deliver that fleet investment.
And going forward, given that there is a 20-year agreement in place, what kind of process has been put in place to ensure the process for the next tender will be, when that comes to an end, will be a lot more smoother, shall we say, than the one that has been entered into recently, should it be ended prematurely?
So that is an excellent question, and to be honest, we haven't started designing the tender process for the next ferry tender agreement, and it's something that should be done. I think corporate memory in the government of Jersey as a whole, the states of Jersey, I'll use this right, is relatively poor, and I think that is in some ways seen by this tender process, because back in 1997, it's my understanding that Jersey and Guernsey did a very similar joint Channel Island tender process, that a different ferry provider that wasn't Condor was offered that tender, and then Guernsey changed its mind and pulled out at the last minute, and the joint tender process fell away, and we ended up with determining the islands would end up sticking with Condor. So in 1997, we had a similar, I will use the term, failed joint tender process. And so I think, but, when I speak to people, most people don't know that. It's, 28 years ago, it is quite some time ago. So we do have to find a way of taking learnings from all this and building that into a corporate memory that can be accessed in the future, because let's be realistic, if this contract goes perfectly well, people won't start thinking about a new tender process until you're 15, 16, 17 years into this contract. What we need to do is make sure that the learnings from this are available to those people in the future, so they can make sure that if there is to be a joint tender process, that it is done in a way which enables or has a greater chance of overall success.
Yeah, and clearly we have the work of this panel. We have Public Accounts Committee, the hearing yesterday. I'm sure we'll have some feedback and thoughts from PAC in due course. The Controller and Auditor General is also doing a review of critical infrastructure resilience. So again, her office may have some thoughts on these matters going forward. So all of that will need to be brought together in terms of an overall sort of lessons learned and notes for the future. So whoever's here in 20 years' time, probably not me, but whoever's here in 20 years' time hopefully has a stronger base to work from.
Thank you. I mean, I think this is why we're trying to focus on the lessons learned with the future going forward.
It's the right thing to do. I appreciate it.
Could you tell us what provision there is in the concession agreement for it to be updated in the future?
Off the top of my head, I'd have to go looking for that.
For the agreement to be updated in the future, or?
Yeah, so if, for example, there was a need to actually change anything or update it because of change in legislation or whatever, what kind of processes do you have in place to address that particular?
So the operator will have to meet with prevailing legislation. So there's provision for that sort of on a general basis within the contract. But if we wanted to vary the contract, there are conditions in there around sort of mutuality. So we could agree to make changes to the contract. So if, for example, DFDS came to us and said, we want to invest in the new RoPax vessel now instead of the new RoRo, so can we switch them around? Then the schedule that deals with fleet investment could be changed by mutual consent at that point in time. So there are those factors, and it means that we're not in a straitjacket. We're in something that has appropriate contractual responsibilities on both sides, but it's not such a straitjacket that you cannot achieve any movement within the life of the contract.
I think as well it's really important. The contract requires DFDS, Ports of Jersey and the Government of Jersey to meet on a regular basis to discuss KPIs, to discuss, from the perspective of revenue that's coming into the fleet. Because, for instance, imagine that for whatever reasons, tourism in Jersey falls away and, the revenue coming into the service is much lower than expected, the DFDS would obviously find it harder to make the fleet investment that they're contractually obliged to. Therefore, they would come to that group, the Ports, Jersey Government and DFDS group, explain the situation, show the figures, and we would, and the contract speaks to this, these 5 levers, we would work with them as to which of those 5 levers we felt would be most appropriate to pull to enable that fleet investment to go ahead, given the lower revenues that were being experienced.
Yeah.
And so we built in this flexibility, which absolutely was not there in the past contract.
So you see clause 44 of the concession agreement deals with variation and the circumstances for that, whether it's around performance or specified events.
Yeah.
And can you just give us an indication of how you will actually, what particular key performance indicators are included in the concession?
So there are elements like a net promoter score, so really like a kind of customer service indexing of our users of the service satisfied and to what extent. There's reliability, punctuality, so service cancellations versus service delays. Are they weather related? Are they technical related? We can't control the weather, so what we want to ensure is if there's weather delays, there's an appropriate notification period. We've agreed that 48 hours is an accurate enough weather window between the operator and the port to say we're going to have to make an adjustment to a sailing, either to delay it or to cancel it altogether. So there are provisions for all of those aspects. And then there are criteria that if they have an excessive number of, say, technical cancellations, then the concession fee starts to kick in. They would start to pay a penalty within the contract for that failure to deliver on an element of the contract.
And so we also have, where there is continual failure to deliver, we have the ability to then put that into effectively a kind of special measures type situation, whereby their performance on that measure would be tracked. If it's, if it doesn't improve, if it's seen as critically bad, we would have the option to kind of exit the contract if there was continual failure in certain areas.
And then all of that's underpinned by a performance bond. So should we ever, and I certainly hope it's not the case, find ourselves in the position that we have with Condor of having to go out and get contingency vessels, there is a performance bond drawn on DFDS bankers that we can call upon that performance bond for DFDS failing to deliver, and that then reimburses the taxpayer for any out-of-pocket costs that we've had to incur.
So, Minister, you talked about the issue of transparency earlier on. Are you going to publish and make these indicators, the performance against these indicators, public? And how often will you track these? I mean, when will the public know whether or not the contract is performing well or not? Will we have regular updates?
Yeah, so we do intend to publish that, and we're more than happy to publish that. I don't know at the moment whether we do that on a kind of quarterly, 6-monthly or annual basis. I genuinely, it's not been decided.
But the contract does mandate the creation of a monitoring committee to look through all of these
The Ports of
metrics.
Jersey Government.
Yeah.
What we want to do, Deputy Wilson, is to promote confidence in the service and to promote confidence in the operator. The issues around sea connectivity can be the stuff of myth. People can say, well, the wind speed in St Helier Harbour is only 15 knots, so why is the sailing being cancelled? But it could be wave heights mid-channel, it could be gusts of wind mid-channel. At the end of the day, we want a responsible operator to make the right decision and not to be impaired in their ability to do that. So what we want to do is promote public confidence around the levels of punctuality, reliability and so on within the service, and that can only be achieved by publishing those statistics, publishing the net promoter score and so on and so forth.
And the confidence that if those things aren't being delivered, we have the ability to rectify that, and which we know. And this is very much about Condor of the past, as opposed to Brittany Ferries of the future in terms of Guernsey. But we know that the current operating agreement has not served islanders, and one of the key reasons it hasn't served islanders is because it's had no ability to encourage, incentivise or enforce the incumbent operator to change anything if they're underperforming. And that, the easy way to say that is it's a lack of teeth. We now have a contract which has some teeth from our side, but it equally, and this has been mentioned, holds us to certain elements as well as an island.
Can I just jump in? Will DFDS be respecting and working to the EU compensation for passengers in terms of delays. So if it's not an EU port, so for example, if there are delays
in
for
short, I don't believe they
more
will
than-
be. That we're not in the EU. That's not part.
but there's I think Condor previously honoured that, didn't they? So
That may have been their choice, and it may be DFDS will, but it's not contractually kind of crystallised.
I'm not certain on the specific points. It might be something we need to follow up in writing, and I'll check
I think it-
specifically in the terms and conditions of carriage. It's not something I recall
It's
as
not
having
contractual,
regard to in the.
One for law officers, what I would say is, as in within the airline industry, if you are an operator originating from an EU member state, France and Saint-Malo, those obligations can apply. But it's one we can take away and come back to the panel.
my understanding, it might just be cursory. I think it's if you're travelling to or from an EU port.
That's right.
But it would be helpful to know if they might honour the same to a UK.
Yeah,
Yeah, if we can come back in writing on that.
yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned earlier around some of the conditions under which the contract will be varied. What contractual conditions will protect Jersey if DFDS do fail to deliver the proposed 300 million investment in new vessels?
So that again comes down to the elements of the contract and that monitoring provision as well. If DFDS, so number one, we would be very aware in advance of their inability, to deliver that part of it. So we would have gone through the whole process, particularly through the monitoring committee, to understand why. If we felt the reasons were very valid, particularly if they were, beyond DFDS's control, let's say, war, things like this, you would have a very different approach to that as an island and dealing with that compared to if it was just DFDS failing to deliver what they said they'd deliver. We would then contractually be able to penalise them in a number of different ways, including potentially exiting the contract.
Yeah, so Schedule 12 of the concession agreement clearly deals with the level of investment that's required and sets deadlines on when that should take place. As you say, that can be varied or it could be reprioritised if there are good reasons for that to happen, and for that to happen, of course, by mutual consent. But fundamentally, the fact that we have this level of investment in specific types of vessel contractualised means that if it doesn't happen, it's a default, it's a breach of the contract. And that's a huge step forwards compared to where we are on the outgoing agreement. And it's a very significant differentiator in what we understand Guernsey to have entered into, where there's no commitment for fleet investment.
And just picking up on worst case scenario, if that were to happen, what time period are we talking about in terms of trying to actually mitigate the risk around that?
So the first level of investment in Schedule 12 of the contract is around a new vessel on the southern route. And that investment is to be completed before the 31st of December 2028. So, in a little over 3 years' time, 3.5 years' time or so, we would have that first critical point around fleet investment.
But I think importantly as well, Philip Herman, speaking to the Chamber of Commerce, said yesterday, that effectively delivery deadline of 2028 is soon. So we know that they need to start work on the design, on the procurement process for that vessel very shortly. He mentioned that yesterday, and so again, we'll be constantly talking to them to understand how that's progressing, and seeking assurance and documentation to prove that assurance that investment is taking place. If they want to deliver a vessel by the end of 2028, we know that they can't go to the shipyards in January 2028 to deliver that. So we would be asking, very likely this year and next year, about that, the scheduling of how's it going to the shipyards, how's it coming along, continuing to monitor that. In the years up to 2028.
But quite rightly, it places obligations back onto the island as well, because if you're going to have a vessel with some form, either wholly or partly, of electrification on the southern route, then you need the port infrastructure
to enable that.
In either or both of the ports to enable that to happen. So we know that DFDS are already in conversations with Ports of Jersey and Jersey Electricity Company around the early stages of how to make that happen and what the kind of timelines would be. So this really is all about partnership going forwards. There are responsibilities on Jersey as a whole to ensure that we can deliver for DFDS and support the delivery of the services that we aspire to. Equally, there are very firm obligations on them to make sure they deliver for island residents and businesses and visitors.
I think as well, it's been really important, working with DFDS over the last few months has shown me that they are highly professional. They do own issues, so where there are things that aren't working or have gone wrong or aren't as we expected, they don't try and hide from it. They stand up and they meet the challenge and then seek ways of solving that problem. So as a partner for the next 20 years, certainly what I'm seeing in these very, very early days is a partner that we will be able to work with quite easily, that will not be giving us the runaround or being vague about things or unsure about things. And where they don't know the information, again, what they've come to us is they've told us they don't know that information, but they'll go off and seek it. So that level of transparency in the conversations we're having with them is giving me a strong sense that my successors in this role as Economic Development Minister will be able to have really good conversations with them and have a real sense of where this service is going.
I mean, obviously we can't see into the future and we are in a bit of a honeymoon period at the moment, but
it doesn't feel much like a honeymoon, I must say.
We haven't even started the relationship yet, really. But just finally from me, one of the things that I just wanted to ask you was what is the difference in terms of the terminology that you're using around a concession and a contract? I mean, is there any difference in the legal basis of those two different arrangements and why we don't talk about the contract, but we do talk about the concession?
Interestingly, Deputy, is I was wondering at the very beginning of this hearing if I should say concession agreement means contract, because you're right. I mean, concession agreement is effectively, it's been called that because we have given a concession on this route, an exclusive concession to a provider. It is entirely analogous to a contract. It holds no less legal weight than a contract does. It's the same thing.
Can I jump? Yeah.
Thank you, Monty.
That's okay. We've broadly covered, I think, some of the other questions we had. I will pass over to Deputy Sutton, but I do want to just, if we can focus for a couple more minutes on the idea of the dynamic pricing, because a lot of the discussion we're here partly to reflect, what the public are asking us. There's quite a lot of disquiet around the dynamic pricing. We saw an article recently in the media which said that, families complaining about the cost of a trip is potentially 48% more than what it might have been or might be with Condor if they were in Guernsey. I know you've explained that you're not necessarily comparing apples with apples, but I think, is that an issue?
You can't compare apples with apples. There is no contractualised fleet investment in Guernsey's contract. That fleet investment has to be paid for, and ultimately it's fare structures that will pay for part of that.
We are in a cost of living crisis, so if people are immediately seeing hikes in the ferry speed, I think you're saying, don't worry because we're going to have an electric boat in 30 years' time.
I think it's really important. Number one is dynamic pricing isn't the issue. The islanders have been using dynamic pricing for the last 10 years on ferries. So dynamic pricing has been here for the last, I say 10 years, it might be 7, it might be however many years. But whether you're booking a flight on EasyJet or British Airways or a boat to France with Condor, islanders have been using dynamic pricing.
Okay, but can I just challenge that? Because you've said in terms of freight, you've taken a different approach. And also, there's a land bridge, right? So we've given exclusive right to DFDS to run this sea bridge, rather. So in terms of planning your budgets as a family, it's really difficult to do that with dynamic pricing.
What I would say is that sea ferry is in direct competition with planes. So we know that only 20% of people who come to Jersey come on the ferries. 80% come by planes.
But you subsidise plane routes, and there are multiple plane routes, right?
It's interesting. Some we do, some we don't. But they're not subsidising the routes. It's usually subsidising the marketing around the routes rather than the routes themselves. So dynamic pricing, in my perspective, it isn't the issue. Pricing, you can absolutely complain about a price. But I think there's no question.
The public are saying it's an issue. They're saying, like, we can only go on holiday during holiday times, half term, we need to get off the island. Now, isn't it bizarre that when the boat is most full, that's actually when it's cheaper for the FTS to run a full boat, presumably, because they can make more money than an empty boat?
I genuinely think, from a philosophical perspective, as Deputy, I know you like to discuss in
that
sort of matter.
If you've got an empty boat, then surely the cost per passenger should be more, not less.
But you want to attract people onto that boat. So if you've got an empty boat and it's sailing at the end of the week, you want to get people onto that boat. So you'll adjust your
It's supply
pricing
and
in a way
demand.
that's
But
where
you
how
might-
supply
you
and
might want
demand
to do-
works.
You might want to do that with freight. If you've got an empty boat of freight, you might want to say, actually come and put more freight on. We'll give you a better price. They're not allowed to do that.
There
under
are
the
no
current
empty
contract.
boats for freight in Jersey.
But freight's not.
There are no empty
We've got
boats
to
for freight.
differentiate. Freight's not a supply and demand business in the same way. The demand for freight is very, very steady and very predictable from a Sunday through to a Saturday. In terms of how many trailers come in. More will come in on a Friday night sailing to stock the shops for a Saturday than come in on a Monday night sailing. More empties go back the other way, commensurate with that. So the demand for freight is a fairly static figure, and it's only really going to ebb and flow if population grows or shrinks. Attracting visitors into the island is a more dynamic business and is more of a supply and demand business, which is why dynamic pricing exists around the passenger and the vehicle charges. We're working with DFDS closely around what the current charges are. The reporting in what was the Guernsey press, I believe, and ITV wasn't taking account of other factors, such as it was comparing trips to Saint Malo. If you go from Guernsey to Saint Malo, you arrive into Saint Malo at 9:15 in the evening. You either need to drive through the night deeper into France, or you need to stay overnight in Saint Malo. With us, you will have up to 3 sailings a day to choose when you arrive into Saint Malo. Those are fundamental differences and fundamentally change the costs. If that family of 4 has to stay an extra 2 nights in Saint Malo, that fundamentally adds to the difference. So it's not comparing apples with apples.
There has been a concerted effort in Guernsey to talk down the service in Jersey. That's fine, that's Guernsey's right. But what they haven't been doing is talking it down in a way which actually encapsulates the real differences between the
So I
services.
accept the ferry
And
service.
I would also, as I know, the dates, etc., the way that those price comparisons were created was done in a way which was created to make the Jersey pricing look worse. I found one, and more than one sailing, where the price difference to the UK car car with driver, a family of 4, in a car to the UK, or not a car actually, it was £188 more expensive to go from Guernsey to the UK than it was Jersey to the UK. So for every time that Guernsey press said, oh, this is more expensive, you could find the opposite. It was that
Minister,
simple.
we're not talking about what Guernsey people are saying. We're talking about what Jersey residents are saying online at the moment about pricing. So
The pricing is very similar to where it was before.
And dynamic doesn't necessarily just mean escalating. It can mean that
Going down,
the operator drops their costs for commercial reasons if they're seeking to fill volume and so on.
But I think let's not be one-sided. There's plenty of other stuff on social media and so on that's saying actually they found that year on year the price of the trip has been cheaper. It's not all one-way traffic. It's not all prices have gone up. Some are saying prices have been cheaper. And there's other, as DFDS have intimated, other steps to come around frequent traveller and outbound loyalty. So if you're a Jersey resident with a Jersey address, there'll be a discount mechanism for you, as opposed to perhaps, a visitor coming to the island who may pay slightly more. So that will reward the loyalty of islanders who are more likely to travel all year round.
likely to get a frequent traveller, do you think?
Those are all things that DFDS have intimated. More details to follow, that they're not contractualised, but they're all the things that we would like them to do
They
to
said
reward,
publicly yesterday.
to reward frequent travellers. So fundamentally, we're in a partnership with a large organisation that's commercially driven, and in return for the right fleet investment, we believe they will deliver the right level of service and a competitive service for island residents, visitors, and for businesses over time. We have to let them go on with delivering what they do best, which is sailing ferries and filling ferries, now that we've got a competitive tender process out of the way.
Thank you. Deputy Sergeant, have you got any questions?
Just finally, to finish up, and I noticed that, Minister, you were very keen on promoting sales to the continent, and I just wondered if there's any conversations already taking place or will take place over new routes into Europe.
Not via the ferries. We are talking about that in terms of aircraft. Ports of Jersey are working on that as a project in terms of European air routes. And in fact, I'm talking to a very, very small provider of air routes into France at the moment. So we may see something there. But on ferries, it is that St Malo link. And then obviously discussions with La Manche and Manche Express around those Norman ports, but nothing beyond that.
I suppose that my last question, and they'll obviously go around the table, is there going to be a period of where both yourselves as government and you can't necessarily speak directly for DFDS, but as far as you understand, will there be a period whereby feedback both from businesses and the public can be submitted or taken into account that might inform any changes before the full service it gets bedded in?
So
I think it has.
I was going to say, I know
yeah.
the DFDS have been
Yeah.
responding, so we've seen already very publicly changes on their bike charging,
Horses.
Pets, horses,
Yeah.
etc. So we've seen them responding.
And scheduling.
I know from a business perspective, yes, they said it publicly again yesterday. They said they had made several changes in response to business feedback around the timetables for freight particularly, and we will see some more changes. Again, that's no different to the current provider in terms of having to make changes, but they have been DFDS have already been extremely responsive to business demands and customer demands.
And I should say, where they're making those changes in light of feedback in these early stages, if that's negatively impacted a passenger, again, this was said yesterday, they're offering a full refund or a change onto an alternative service. So, no one's left behind, so to speak, or disadvantaged in that regard.
Just one more thing. I think earlier you mentioned that there were 5 possible levers that could be used if passengers were lower than anticipated, or if the revenue for DFDS was lower. Could you just outline what those 5 levers are?
Yeah, so we have fleet investment. So the fleet investment can be delayed, it could be reduced, it could be changed effectively. We have ticket pricing, so you could have a discussion about whether increasing price of tickets might work in that way. Forget about all the rest of them.
Scheduling. You could reduce the number of sailings. So really, it's all the things. Much was made of this around the time of the tender process. These sort of 5 levers. Fundamentally, these levers have all been pulled in the last 10 years by Condor, but they've been pulled forcibly, and the islands have just been told to suck it up. The difference this time around is there'll be a sensible discussion between the operator and the islands under the concession agreement to say, so what's best to give? What's best in terms of minimising the impact of this? Because again, we want a ferry service that's resilient and investable and financially sustainable.
So the lever that might have been pulled about increasing the prices can't happen automatically if it goes above the...
That's correct.
There's a cap mechanism.
But it could possibly happen if there was a conversation and it was in extremis.
That's right. Yeah. My guess is, though, if DFDS, if it was with me, let's say if DFDS were to come and say, look, we've been operating for 2 years, the revenue's not where we expected it to be, building that first boat has become more difficult as a result. Personally, myself, I'd be looking at things like pushing out the fleet investment before raising ticket prices. I think that would be the case for most ministers, whoever they are, that they'd start with that sort of discussion first, I would expect.
Yeah.
Deputy Wilson?
Thank you. Yes, there was just one question about competition in terms of how you might manage the competition between the 2 ferry operators in the Channel Islands over the next 4 to 5 years, and whether you envisage any particular issues associated with that.
I don't. I think the main question is where we started this hearing, actually, on those inter-island services. I think there has to be a level of trust about the possibility of leakage from one route to the other. I think the impacts, if there were to be leakage, would be minimal anyway. So, my kind of request to the operators is, look, work in good faith with each other to come up with some inter-island services which work for the islands. And in our case, that is probably using the northern route ferry rather than the southern route ferry. Why it matters to Brittany Ferries or Guernsey as to which of our ferries we use for an inter-island service, I have no idea. But we believe it's more viable to do that with our northern route ferry.
Yeah. I mean, there is no real competition the way the routes are structured, other than the fact that one's serving Jersey, one's serving Guernsey, and in that sense, there's no competition of where you prefer to visit. So.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I think we've got 4 levers because I've been told, but is the 5th lever slower ferries? Is that so?
You can also reduce speed, so that can be it as well.
But that's
also,
not desirable,
pushing out fleet investment is one. Reducing fleet investment is potentially not.
Thank you. Any questions from my fellow panel members? Any final remarks, Minister?
Other than I'm looking forward to the services starting, because I think, as you said, Chair, at the very beginning, once this is up and running,
It is interesting to
People
see
be able
the
to move on.
public comments. I think there's both a mixture of excitement and nostalgia. So
Jersey's
certainly.
strong on nostalgia, but
Yeah, I
we need
think-
to look for the future on this one.
I mean, one last thing I suppose is that we are all familiar with a lot of the Condor staff. Have steps been made to try wherever possible to make sure that Jersey-based staff are reallocated if they want to work for the
That's
new
right.
operator?
So I'm really pleased to say that DFDS and Condor have been working together on that very issue. And I know, obviously, I don't know the roles exactly, but I know DFDS have already appointed some Condor staff or made offers to Condor
So
staff.
in the chamber lunch yesterday, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the number was 25 staff from Condor moving over in Jersey to the new operator, to DFDS. And in total, DFDS plan to employ 54 people here in Jersey. So, significant number. And again, it's that localised presence and local accountability that is going to be so important.
And the two operators are working together. So if Condor staff are moving over to DFDS, they can train and be inducted contemporaneously without impacting on the Condor services.
Do you know if there's any trade union involvement with that? Were there conversations or?
I don't know whether there is or not.
No, I think there would be in the UK and France. In that context, you've got TUPE obligations as well, so both sides of the channel. We don't have that here. So DFDS have been in conversations with those employees about effectively seamless transition out of one and onto the other. I don't know the extent to which unions have been consulted. DFDS haven't lost a day to union action in decades. They take that, Gemma Griffin, who's their head of crewing globally, they take that responsibility very, very seriously in terms of having the strongest possible relations. And I go back to that representation from the RMT, it really points to the strength of those.
Just
Yes, Deputy, I know we're on the one.
The hand suddenly went up.
We'll
So
give Deputy Wilson a question.
Thank you. Very briefly, sorry, can I just clarify whether all of the arrangements around docking and berthing around particular slots at St Malo have been sorted now? I believe there was some concern about that early on, but there doesn't seem to be any further news on that. Perhaps you could just update us.
if that's all been done, as I understand it, that's done and dusted. There were no real issues that I know of, but
No, again, it was deconfliction. It's making sure that the Jersey vessels are arriving in and that, it fits in with other sailings. Clearly, Brittany and Condor were already out with their timetables whilst we were tied up in a second tender process and a court case. So that's now been deconflicted from St Malo's perspective that, we have certain sailing times. And once we've got services mobilised, attention will then turn to putting the 2026 timetable together and appropriately deconflicting that with other operators.
And has this had any impact on the timing of the sailings at all?
it will do. It necessarily has to. Deconfliction means that, if one boat's there at 10 o'clock, the other boat can't go there at 10 o'clock, it has to go in at 11 o'clock. So it necessarily does. And obviously one of the things I'm sure DFDS are looking forward to as well is that obviously without a tender process to go through this year, they'll be able to work with all the ports that they're operating to, Jersey, the UK ports and St Malo, in a much more timely fashion to get their requests in for times and slots and things like this.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Minister, thank you for attending
thank
upon
you.
us today.
Thank
I know
you.
you've been busy, as we all have in a different way, I suppose.
We're all busy.
So we wish you all the best with the new contract and obviously to the new operator, and we'll be watching closely.
I'm sure you will.
Thank you.